The logic behind Russia's war against Ukraine was supposed to be straightforward. Russia's population is roughly 4 times larger than Ukraine's, so in Putin's mind, the solution was simple. Flood the battlefield with enough troops until Ukraine's defenses buckle and the so-called special military operation would be finished. It's a formula Russia has relied on before, and historically mass has often been Moscow's answer, but Ukraine has shattered that equation. Instead of collapsing, Ukraine has imposed a catastrophic death toll that is now crushing Putin's front lines. We're going to get into why this is happening to Russia later in the video. But first, we need to look at a couple of headline numbers that show just how brutal this war has been, and still is, for the Russian military. And the first statistic tells you immediately how draining Ukraine has become for Russia. Russia is now officially losing roughly twice as many soldiers per month in Ukraine as it lost during its entire decade-long war in Afghanistan. The Ukraine meat grinder has become so brutally efficient that it is destroying around 35,000 Russian soldiers per month. That figure comes from Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy, who met with Ukrainian troops during an event focused on launching a new drone unit initiative. During that presentation, he shared the statistic and also emphasized that Russia's fatality numbers climbed sharply month after month throughout 2025. TVP World adds more context, noting that Zelenskyy said Russian fatalities increased from 14,000 per month to 35,000 per month over the course of the year. And when you add in the wounded, the captured, and the deserters, Zelenskyy argues that Russia has reached a point where its army is finally stalling. How does he explain it? Zelenskyy says Russia is suffering as many as 45,000 casualties per month, while mobilizing only 40,000 to 43,000 troops over the same period. Zelenskyy adds, of those 43,000, about 10-15% desert, and there are wounded as well. You can see that their army is no longer growing, thanks to our drone technologies and drone operators. That reference to drone operators is crucial, because Zelenskyy says drones are responsible for the majority of Russia's deaths in Ukraine right now. And the number he points to is another jaw-dropping statistic. 80% of all Russians killed in Ukraine are being killed by Ukraine's unmanned aerial vehicles. These small weapons are striking with such accuracy and explosive effect that Russia appears unable to stop them. And by the way, we've already published a video that breaks down what it means when Ukraine conducts 80% of its strikes against Russian targets using drones, what that implies for both Ukraine and Russia. If you want a deeper dive into that specific number, go watch that video. Russia losing more soldiers in 1 month in Ukraine than the 15,000 it lost across the entire Afghanistan war is bad enough. But the second statistic we need to cover makes the situation dramatically worse. You may have caught a subtle clue earlier. We told you Zelenskyy says Russia is suffering up to 45,000 casualties per month, but we also said that in December, Ukraine's drone operators killed 35,000 Russian soldiers. If those figures feel like they don't quite line up, you're right to notice it. Russia's dead-to-wounded ratio is horrific, and that's another major reason the math of Putin's war is failing. Traditionally, the expected wartime ratio is about 1 death for every 3 wounded. That benchmark didn't come out of nowhere. It's based on the average killed-to-injured ratio seen during World War II, the deadliest conflict the world has ever experienced. That ratio is a useful baseline, but it doesn't fully account for how warfare and medicine have changed. Modern combat methods and improved battlefield medical care usually make the ratio more favorable, meaning more wounded survive. For example, the U.S. ratio in Afghanistan was roughly 1 dead for every 10 wounded, and among U.S. Marines it was even lower, about 1 dead for every 13 wounded. Russia, supposedly one of the most powerful militaries on Earth, should at least be able to keep to the World War II baseline of 1 to 3. But it isn't. It's not even close. In fact, Russia is so far from that standard that it's reaching a point where more Russian soldiers are being killed than injured in Ukraine. That wasn't true in the first phase of the invasion. Up through the spring of 2024, Russia was roughly maintaining the 1 to 3 ratio seen in World War II. Again, that still wasn't good. Russia should have performed better given its equipment and resources. But at least the ratio implied the war's math could work over time. After all, a wounded soldier can sometimes return to the battlefield, assuming the injury doesn't permanently disable them. Combine returning wounded troops with fresh mobilized recruits and contract soldiers, and Russia could, in theory, keep replenishing losses and keep pressure on Ukraine. But in the spring of 2024, things began to go wrong. Slowly at first, then relentlessly. Little by little, Russia's dead-to-wounded ratio started deteriorating. It worsened into 2 to 3, then 3 to 3. And by the end of 2025, the trend had flipped into something no modern military wants to see. Russia was losing more troops to death than to injury. By the end of 2025, Russian fatalities made up 56% of total Russian casualties, producing a ratio of 12 killed for every 10 wounded. You could also express it as 6 dead for every 5 injured, but either way it's disastrous for Russia. Zelensky's point that Russia's losses are becoming unsustainable looks even more brutal through this lens. And as Putin sits surrounded by the handful of loyalists he hasn't purged, he has to be asking the question we raised at the very start. Why is this happening to Russia? Yes, Russia's broad incompetence and reliance on attritional tactics naturally generate heavy losses, but there are 2 main reasons its dead-to-injured ratio has become so distorted. And the first reason is probably exactly what you expect: Ukraine's drones. What we've watched during the war, especially in the last 2 years, is drones replacing artillery as Ukraine's most efficient killing tool. Even just in sheer volume, Ukraine's drone presence is constant and unavoidable. In 2025 alone, Ukraine planned to produce at least 2.5 million drones, and by the end of the year it may have reached a production capacity of 4.5 million. Those drones, as Zelenskyy emphasized, are killing Russian troops in record numbers because they are far more precise and lethal than artillery in many practical battlefield scenarios. To be clear, a direct hit from artillery can obliterate a soldier, but as Ukraine Today explains, that isn't what usually happens. More often, shells land near a target, and the explosion sends shrapnel outward in all directions. Shrapnel is deadly, but it also frequently produces injuries rather than immediate fatalities. FPV drones are different. FPV drones trade raw explosive power for precision. Their payloads are smaller, yes, but they're cheap. They can be guided directly into a target, and their accuracy makes a kill more likely. Combine that level of precision with the massive number of drones Ukraine can deploy, and you get a constant threat that is more effective at killing than artillery has historically been. That lethal efficiency is exactly what produced the 2025 figure we mentioned earlier, Ukraine destroying 80% of its targets using drones, and drones are even starting to take over missions that were once artillery's specialty. Artillery has always been key for suppressing troop movement and targeting choke points, forcing an attacking unit into a kill zone and punishing it. Ukraine still uses artillery for that, but now drones are doing it too. So when a Russian unit gets pinned in an area being hit by artillery, it isn't just dealing with explosions and shrapnel anymore, it's also being hammered by FPV drones. The artillery triggers chaos and causes casualties. The drones deliver precise kills, and they can even be used to finish off wounded soldiers who might have survived their shrapnel injuries. And that leads directly into the second reason Russia's dead-to-wounded ratio has become so abnormal. But before we go further, if this kind of battlefield strategy breakdown is what you like, make sure you're subscribed to The Military Show. We cover developments like this in daily videos. The Ukrainian battlefield's saturation with drones doesn't only mean more Russians die from precision strikes, it also means evacuating the wounded has become incredibly difficult. Soldiers who might have survived an artillery strike are now far more likely to be abandoned, because rescue itself becomes a target. Ukraine is using a potent combination of strike drones and reconnaissance drones. The reconnaissance platforms track and record Russian movements across open terrain with extreme effectiveness. Once Ukraine knows where troops are moving, it can strike. And even after the initial strike ends, reconnaissance drones keep watching relentlessly, so that if Russia tries to send evacuation teams, Ukraine can respond immediately. The effect on Russian manpower is catastrophic, so stay with us through the end to see how severe this problem really is. Ukraine's drone expansion also destroys something known in military medicine as the golden hour. The golden hour is the critical window after a soldier is injured when evacuation to medical care has the highest probability of saving their life. Ukraine's drone wall has stripped that golden hour away from Russian forces. Now, evacuation teams can't simply move fast. They often have to wait, sometimes indefinitely, for a gap in drone coverage, assuming one ever appears, before they even attempt rescue. In short, Russia is taking too long to extract wounded troops, and in war, minutes decide survival. And it's not like Russia was particularly competent at evacuations even before 2025 changed the battlefield dynamic. In July 2024, Medusa reported that Russian military doctors were already saying soldiers who could have been saved were dying in ditches and mud instead. Russia's defense ministry tried to paint a different picture. It claimed the mortality rate for soldiers who died from potentially survivable injuries was only 0.43% in 2023, referring to soldiers who received some treatment but died anyway. But the ministry's own doctors used a different measurement: potentially savable soldiers. And by that standard, at least 5.2% of Russian soldiers who died in 2023 from treatable injuries did so without receiving any medical help at all. That's the real issue. Even if the 0.43% figure were true for treated soldiers, the fact that 5.2% were dying without treatment revealed an evacuation and medical access crisis that existed even before Ukraine's drone saturation became so overwhelming. Some Ukrainian troops have witnessed Russia's evacuation failures directly. In August 2024, Espresso.Global interviewed Kirilo Duchko, a staff sergeant in Ukraine's 13th Operational Brigade Charter of the National Guard. He said, "The enemy does not take away its killed personnel. They are lying in the middle of an open field. I'll tell you more, the Russians do not even evacuate their wounded. Accordingly, the wounded are either dying themselves or the Ukrainian defense forces are helping them." And Duchko isn't the only voice describing this strange reality. In a February 2025 Washington Post article, Jim Garagdy wrote about visiting injured Russians being treated in Ukrainian hospitals. But here's the twist. The people he spoke with weren't soldiers. They were ordinary Russian civilians who had been living in Kursk Oblast during Ukraine's occupation. Russia responded by shelling occupied settlements, and civilians were struck by their own side's fire. One patient, Ludmila, described sitting in her home when she heard a plane overhead. Seconds later, an explosion collapsed the roof and trapped her in rubble. Her son survived and sought help from Ukrainian soldiers. Ludmila was pulled out and transported across the border to a Ukrainian hospital. In her words, "If there had not been Ukrainian soldiers there, we do not know what would have happened to us." It says everything when Russian civilians have a better chance of evacuation through Ukrainian troops than through their own side. But back to Russia's 2025 evacuation reality, where Ukraine's drones are disrupting rescue more than ever. It increasingly looks like leaving soldiers behind is not an accident. It functions almost like an accepted feature of Russia's approach. Throughout much of 2025, Russia relied heavily on infiltration tactics, sneaking tiny units into Ukrainian settlements. Those tactics require troops to cross behind Ukrainian lines, dig in, and wait for reinforcements to arrive so the area can be formally seized. But more often than not, the reinforcements never arrive. And if reinforcements do come, they may not include tanks or armored vehicles, because Russia has burned through Soviet-era stockpiles so severely that it increasingly depends on infiltration tactics instead of heavy armor spearheads. Now, think about what happens if an infiltrator is wounded behind Ukrainian lines. No Russian evacuation teams are coming for them. Their best hope is that Ukraine captures them rather than a drone finishing them off. So now we understand two key realities. Russia is losing soldiers faster than at any previous point, and Russia's dead-to-wounded ratio has shifted so badly that more casualties are deaths than injuries. So the obvious question, one we raised earlier, is what does this mean for Russia's manpower going forward? The answer is bleak. Russia cannot expand the size of its army in Ukraine, neither in raw numbers nor in battlefield capability. On capability, every soldier killed by a drone is a soldier with at least some combat experience. Sometimes that experience is nothing more than participating in near-suicidal assaults, but some troops also carry specialized knowledge, understanding Ukrainian defenses, recognizing patterns, knowing Russian plans. All of that disappears the moment a drone kills them. And the replacements Russia sends in are often brand new recruits who have never seen combat. Battlefield experience is being erased faster than it can be transferred. The soldiers who might have trained newcomers are dying instead, blown apart in assaults, and recruits with no mentors die faster. Russia has entered a vicious cycle. Each new wave of reinforcements is being destroyed faster than the wave before it. On the numbers side, the situation isn't much better. Russia has maintained a manpower edge up to this point, but now we're starting to see losses outpace recruiting. As the Kyiv Independent reported in December, Russia's recruitment target for 2026 is 409,000 soldiers. That is a little over 34,000 recruits per month, which is 1,000 fewer than the 35,000 Russian troops Ukraine killed in December. And remember, those were kills, not total casualties. So Russia's recruitment plan suggests it may be aiming for as many as 10,000 fewer soldiers per month than it is losing through death and injury. Ukraine has also set itself a 2026 objective, 50,000 Russian deaths per month. If Ukraine comes close to that, Russian recruiting will be nowhere near sufficient to sustain the losses Russia is absorbing. Once again, Putin's military math stops working. What all of this amounts to, according to the European Council on Foreign Relations, the ECFR, is the collapse of the Russian endurance myth that has hovered over much of the war. As the ECFR notes, the staggering blood price Putin has paid hasn't produced impressive strategic results. Yet despite all of this, Kyiv still controls roughly 80% of its internationally recognized territory. Since 2014-15, when Russia first seized 7% of Ukraine, Moscow has captured just another 13%, some 116,206 square kilometers, the ECFR points out. The warning bells are now ringing for Russia's front line. Russia hasn't fully collapsed yet, but these numbers show a force that is sliding toward a collective deathbed, where more and more soldiers die and replacements arrive with no understanding of what's waiting for them in the killing fields that now define Ukraine's front. What Putin is witnessing is the inevitable result of an attritional strategy that is collapsing in front of him. Endless losses and relentless pressure cannot continue forever, and Ukraine is making sure of that. Putin's final gamble is that the West will save him, and you can learn what that means and why it won't happen in our video. And if you enjoyed this analysis, remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more breakdowns exposing the damage Ukraine is doing to Russia's carefully crafted image as one of the world's most powerful nations.